An anomaly which often struck me in the character of my friend Sherlock Holmes was that, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, he was none the less in his personal habits one of the most untidy men that ever drove a fellow lodger to distraction. I have always held, too, that pistol practice should be distinctly an open-air pastime, and when Holmes, in one of his queer humors, would sit in an armchair with his hair, trigger and 100 boxer cartridges, and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR done in bullet pox. Our chambers were always full of chemicals and of criminal relics which had a way of wandering into unlikely positions, but his papers were my great crux. He had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected with his past cases. Thus month after month his papers accumulated, until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript. One winter's night, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to suggest to him that, as he had finished pasting extracts into his commonplace book, he might employ the next 2 hours in making our room a little more habitable. But with a rather rueful face he went off to his bedroom, from which he returned presently pulling a large tin box behind him.
"There are cases enough here, Watson,"
said he, looking at me with mischievous eyes.
"I think if you knew all that I had in this box you would ask me to pull some out instead of putting others in."
"These are the records of your early work, then? I have often wished that I had notes of those cases."
"Yes, my boy, these were all done prematurely before my biographer had come to glorify me. They are not all successes, Watson, but there are some pretty little problems among them. Here's the record of the Tarleton murders, and the case of Vambury, the wine merchant, and the adventure of the old Russian woman, and the singular affair of the aluminium crutch, as well as a full account of Ricoletti of the clubfoot, and his abominable wife. And here, now, this really is something a little richer, Che."
He dived his arm down to the bottom of the chest and brought up a small wooden box with a sliding lid. From within he produced a crumpled piece of paper, an old-fashioned brass key, a peg of wood with a ball of string attached to it, and 3 rusty old discs of metal.
"Well, my boy, what do you make of this lot?"
he asked, smiling at my expression.
"It is a curious collection."
"Very curious, and the story that hangs round it will strike you as being more curious still. These,"
said he,
"are all that I have left to remind me of the adventure of the Musgrave Ritual."
"I should be so glad,"
said I,
"if you would give me an account of it."
"And leave the litter as it is? Your tidiness won't bear much strain after all, Watson. But I should be glad that you should add this case to your annals, for there are points in it which make it quite unique in the criminal records of this or, I believe, of any other country. A collection of my trifling achievements would certainly be incomplete which contained no account of this very singular business. You may remember how the affair of the Gloria Scott first turned my attention in the direction of the profession which has become my life's work. You see me now when my name has become known far and wide, and when I am generally recognized as being a final court of appeal in doubtful cases. Even when you knew me first, at the time of the affair which you have commemorated in a study in scarlet, I had already established a considerable connection. When I first came up to London I had rooms in Montague Street, just round the corner from the British Museum. The third of these cases was that of the Musgrave Ritual, and it is to the interest which was aroused by that singular chain of events that I trace my first stride towards the position which I now hold. Reginald Musgrave had been in the same college as myself. He was not generally popular among the undergraduates. In appearance he was a man of exceedingly aristocratic type, thin, high-nosed, and large-eyed, with languid and yet courtly manners. For 4 years I had seen nothing of him, until one morning he walked into my room in Montague Street.
"You probably heard of my poor father's death," said he. "I was carried off about 2 years ago, but I understand, Holmes, that you are turning to practical ends those powers with which you used to amaze us."
"Yes," said I have taken to living by my wits."
"I am delighted to hear it, for your advice at present would be exceedingly valuable to me. We have had some very strange doings at Hurlstone."
You can imagine with what eagerness I listened to him, Watson, for the very chance for which I had been panting seemed to have come within my reach. "Pray, let me have the details," I cried.
"You must know," said he, "that though I am a bachelor, I have to keep up a considerable staff of servants at Hurlstone. Of these servants the one who had been longest in our service was Brunton the butler. With his personal advantages and his extraordinary gifts, for he can speak several languages and play nearly every musical instrument. But this paragon has one fault. He is a bit of a Don Juan. He became engaged to Rachel Howells, our second housemaid, but he has thrown her over since then and taken up with Janet Tregellis. Rachel, who is a very good girl, but of an excitable Welsh temperament, had a sharp touch of brain fever, and goes about the house now, or did until yesterday, like a black-eyed shadow of her former self. That was our first drama at Hurlstone, but a second one came to drive it from our minds, and it was prefaced by the disgrace and dismissal of Butler Brunton. This was how it came about. I have said that the man was intelligent, and this very intelligence has caused his ruin. For it seems to have led to an insatiable curiosity about things which did not in the least concern him. I had no idea of the lengths to which this would carry him until the merest accident opened my eyes to it. One day last week, on Thursday night, to be more exact, I found that I could not sleep, having foolishly taken a cup of strong café, nor after my dinner. After struggling against it until 2 in the morning, I felt that it was quite hopeless, so I rose and lit the candle. The book, however, had been left in the billiard room, so I pulled on my dressing gown and started off to get it. In order to reach the billiard room, I had to descend a flight of stairs, and then to cross the head of a passage which led to the library and the gun room. You can imagine my surprise when, as I looked down this corridor, I saw a glimmer of light coming from the open door of the library. I had myself extinguished the lamp and closed the door before coming to bed. Naturally, my first thought was of burglars. From one of these I picked a battle axe, and then, leaving my candle behind me, I crept on tiptoe down the passage and peeped in at the open door. Brunton, the butler, was in the library. He was sitting fully dressed, in an easy chair, with a slip of paper which looked like a map upon his knee. Suddenly, as I looked, he rose from his chair, and walking over to a bureau at the side, he unlocked it and drew out one of the drawers. From this he took a paper and began to study it with minute attention. My indignation overcame me so far that I took a step forward, and Brunton, looking up, saw me standing in the doorway. He sprang to his feet, his face turned livid with fear. "So," said I, "this is how you repay the trust which we have reposed in you. You will leave my service to-morrow." Bowed with the look of a man who is utterly crushed, and slunk past me without a word. The taper was still on the table, and by its light I glanced to see what the paper was which Brunton had taken from the bureau. To my surprise, it was nothing of any importance at all, but simply a copy of the questions and answers in the singular old observance called the Musgrave Ritual. It is a sort of ceremony peculiar to our family, which each Musgrave for centuries past has gone through on his coming of age.
We had better come back to the paper afterwards.
"If you think it really necessary," he answered with some hesitation. To continue my statement, however, I relocked the bureau. I had turned to go when I was surprised to find that the butler had returned and was standing before me.
"Mr. Musgrave, sir," he cried, in a voice which was hoarse with emotion, "I can't bear disgrace, sir. I've always been proud above my station in life, and disgrace would kill me. If you cannot keep me after what has passed, then for God's sake let me give you notice and leave in a month, as if of my own free will."
"You don't deserve much consideration, Brunton," I answered. "Your conduct has been most infamous. However, as you have been a long time in the family, a month, however, is too long. Take yourself away in a week."
"Only a week, sir," he cried in a despairing voice. "A fortnight! Say at least a fortnight!"
"A week," I repeated, "and you may consider yourself to have been very leniently dealt with." He crept away, his face sunk upon his breast like a broken man, while I put out the light and returned to my room. For 2 days after this Brunton was most assiduous in his attention to his duties. I made no allusion to what had passed. On the third morning, however, he did not appear. As I left the dining room I happened to meet Rachel Howells, the maid. "You should be in bed," I said. "Come back to your duties when you are stronger."
I am strong enough, Mr. Musgrave.
When you go downstairs, just say that I wish to see Brunton. The butler is gone, said she. Gone? Gone where? She fell back against the wall with shriek after shriek of laughter, while I, horrified at this sudden hysterical attack, rushed to the bell to summon help. The girl was taken to her room, still screaming and sobbing, while I made inquiries about Brunton. There was no doubt about it that he had disappeared. His bed had not been slept in, he had been seen by no one since he had retired to his room the night before. His clothes, his watch, and even his money were in his room, but the black suit which he usually wore was missing. His slippers, too, were gone, but his boots were left behind. Where, then, could butler Brunton have gone in the night, and what could have become of him now? Of course we searched the house from cellar to garret, but there was no trace of him. It is, as I have said, a labyrinth of an old house. Rain had fallen on the night before, and we examined the lawn and the paths all round the house, but in vain. Matters were in this state, when a new development quite drew our attention away from the original mystery. For 2 days Rachel Howells had been so ill that a nurse had been employed to sit up with her at night. On the 3rd night after Brunton's disappearance, the nurse woke in the early morning to find the bed empty, the window open, and no signs of the invalid. I was instantly aroused and, with the 2 footmen, started off at once in search of the missing girl. It was not difficult to tell the direction which she had taken, for, starting from under her window, we could follow her footmarks easily across the lawn to the edge of the mere, where they vanished close to the gravel path which leads out of the grounds. The lake there is 8 feet deep, and you can imagine our feelings when we saw that the trail of the poor demented girl came to an end at the edge of it. Of course, we had the drags at once, and set to work to recover the remains, but no trace of the body could we find. On the other hand, we brought to the surface an object of a most unexpected kind. It was a linen bag, which contained within it a mass of old rusted and discolored metal, and several dull, colored pieces of pebble or glass. The county police are at their wits' end, and I have come up to you as a last resource.
You can imagine, Watson, with what eagerness I listened to this extraordinary sequence of events, and endeavored to piece them together. The butler was gone. The maid was gone. The maid had loved the butler, but had afterwards had cause to hate him. She was of Welsh blood, fiery and passionate. She had been terribly excited immediately after his disappearance. She had flung into the lake a bag containing some curious contents. These were all factors which had to be taken into consideration, and yet none of them got quite to the heart of the matter. What was the starting point of this chain of events? There lay the end of this tangled line. I must see that paper, Musgrave, which this butler of yours thought it worth his while to consult, even at the risk of the loss of his place.
It is rather an absurd business, this ritual of ours, he answered, but it has at least the saving grace of antiquity to excuse it.
He handed me the very paper which I have here, Watson, and this is the strange catechism to which each Musgrave had to submit when he came to man's estate. Whose was it? His who is gone? Who shall have it? He who will come? Where was the sun? Over the oak. Where was the shadow? Under the elm. How was it stepped? North by 10 and by 10, east by 5 and by 5, south by 2 and by 2, west by 1 and by 1, and so under.
The original has no date, but is in the spelling of the middle of the 17th century, remarked Musgrave.
At least, said I, it gives us another mystery, and one which is even more interesting than the first. You will excuse me, Musgrave, if I say that your butler appears to me to have been a very clever man, and to have had a clearer insight than 10 generations of his masters. I don't think that we should have much difficulty in determining that, said I. With your permission we will take the first train down to Sussex. The same afternoon saw us both at Hurlstone. Possibly you have seen pictures and read descriptions of the famous old building, so I will confine my account of it to saying that it is built in the shape of an L, the long arm being the more modern portion, and the shorter the ancient nucleus. A splendid park with fine old timber surrounds the house, and the lake, to which my client had referred, lay close to the avenue, about 200 yards from the building. I was already firmly convinced, Watson, that there were not three separate mysteries here, but one only, and that if I could read the Musgrave Ritual, aright I should hold in my hand the clue which would lead me to the truth? To that then I turned all my energies. Why should this servant be so anxious to master this old formula? Evidently because he saw something in it which had escaped all those generations of country squires. It was perfectly obvious to me, on reading the ritual, that the measurements must refer to some spot. There were two guides given us to start with, an oak and an elm. As to the oak there could be no question at all. Right in front of the house, upon the left-hand side of the drive, there stood a patriarch among oaks, one of the most magnificent trees that I have ever seen.
It was there at the Norman Conquest in all probability, he answered. It has a girth of 23 feet.
Have you any old elms? I asked.
There used to be a very old one over yonder, but it was struck by lightning 10 years ago, and we cut down the stump.
You can see where it used to be.
Oh yes.
There are no other elms?
No old ones, but plenty of beeches.
We had driven up in a dog cart, and my client led me away at once, without our entering the house, to the scar on the lawn where the elm had stood. It was nearly midway between the oak and the house. My investigation seemed to be progressing. I suppose it is impossible to find out how high the elm was, I asked.
I can give you it at once. It was 64 feet. When my old tutor used to give me an exercise in trigonometry, it always took the shape of measuring heights. When I was a lad I worked out every tree and building in the estate.
Tell me, I asked, did your butler ever ask you such a question?
Now that you call it to my mind, he answered. Brunton did ask me about the height of the tree some months ago.
This was excellent news, Watson, for it showed me that I was on the right road. I looked up at the sun. It was low in the heavens, and I calculated that in less than an hour it would lie just above the topmost branches of the old oak. And the shadow of the elm must mean the farther end of the shadow, otherwise the trunk would have been chosen as the guide. I had, then, to find where the far end of the shadow would fall when the sun was just clear of the oak.
That must have been difficult, Holmes, when the elm was no longer there.
Well, at least I knew that if Brunton could do it, I could also. I went with Musgrave to his study and whittled myself this peg. Then I took 2 lengths of a fishing rod, which came to just 6 feet, and I went back with my client to where the elm had been. The sun was just grazing the top of the oak. I fastened the rod on end, marked out the direction of the shadow, and measured it. It was 9 feet in length. Of course, the calculation now was a simple one. If a rod of 6 feet threw a shadow of 9, a tree of 60, 4 feet would throw one of 90, 6, and the line of the one would of course be the line of the other. I measured out the distance, which brought me almost to the wall of the house, and I thrust a peg into the spot. You can imagine my exultation, Watson, when within 2 inches of my peg I saw a conical depression in the ground. From this starting point I proceeded to step, having first taken the cardinal points by my pocket compass. 10 steps with each foot took me along parallel with the wall of the house. Then I carefully paced off 5 to the east and 2 to the south. It brought me to the very threshold of the old door. 2 steps to the west meant now that I was to go 2 paces down the stone, flagged passage. Never have I felt such a cold chill of disappointment, Watson. For a moment it seemed to me that there must be some radical mistake in my calculations. The setting sun shone full upon the passage floor, and I could see that the old, foot-worn gray stones had certainly not been moved for many a long year. But, fortunately, Musgrave, who had begun to appreciate the meaning of my proceedings, took out his manuscript to check my calculation.
And under,
he cried.
You have omitted the under.
There is a cellar under this, then?
Yes, and as old as the house. Down here, through this door.
We went down a winding stone stair, and my companion, striking a match, lit a large lantern which stood on a barrel in the corner. In an instant it was obvious that we had at last come upon the true place. It had been used for the storage of wood, but the billets were now piled at the sides so as to leave a clear space in the middle. In this space lay a large and heavy flagstone with a rusted iron ring in the center.
By Jove! Cried my client. That's Brunton's muffler. I have seen it on him, and could swear to it. What has the villain been doing here?
At my suggestion a couple of the county police were summoned, and I then endeavored to raise the stone by pulling on the cravat. I could only move it slightly, and it was with the aid of one of the constables that I succeeded at last in carrying it to one side. A black hole yawned beneath into which we all peered, while Musgrave, kneeling at the side, pushed down the lantern. A small chamber about 7 feet deep and 4 feet square lay open to us. At one side of this was a squat, brass-bound wooden box. It was furred outside by a thick layer of dust, and damp and worms had eaten through the wood. Several discs of metal, old coins apparently, such as I hold here, were scattered over the bottom of the box, but it contained nothing else. At the moment, however, we had no thought for the old chest, for our eyes were riveted upon that which crouched beside it. It was the figure of a man, clad in a suit of black, but his height, his dress, and his hair were all sufficient to show my client, when we had drawn the body up, that it was indeed his missing butler. I had been dead some days, but there was no wound or bruise upon his person to show how he had met his dreadful end. When his body had been carried from the cellar, we found ourselves still confronted with a problem, which was almost as formidable as that with which we had started. I confess that so far, Watson, I had been disappointed in my investigation, but now I had to ascertain how that fate had come upon him, and what part had been played in the matter by the woman who had disappeared. You know my methods in such cases, Watson. I put myself in the man's place, and having first gauged his intelligence, I try to imagine how I should myself have proceeded under the same circumstances. He knew that something valuable was concealed. He had spotted the place. He found that the stone which covered it was just too heavy for a man to move unaided. What would he do next? It was better, if he could, to have his helpmate inside the house. But whom could he ask? This girl had been devoted to him. He would try by a few attentions to make his peace with the girl Howells, and then would engage her as his accomplice. Together they would come at night to the cellar, and their united force would suffice to raise the stone. So far I could follow their actions as if I had actually seen them. But for 2 of them, and one a woman, it must have been heavy work. What would they do to assist them? Probably what I should have done myself. I rose and examined carefully the different billets of wood which were scattered round the floor. Almost at once I came upon what I expected. One piece, about 3 feet in length, had a very marked indentation at one end, while several were flattened at the sides, as if they had been compressed by some considerable weight. And now how was I to proceed to reconstruct this midnight drama? Clearly, only one could fit into the hole, and that one was Brunton. The girl must have waited above. Brunton then unlocked the box, handed up the contents presumably, since they were not to be found. And then what happened? What smoldering fire of vengeance had suddenly sprung into flame in this passionate Celtic woman's soul when she saw the man who had wronged her in her power? Was it a chance that the wood had slipped? Or had some sudden blow from her hand dashed the support away and sent the slab crashing down into its place? Be that as it might, I seemed to see that woman's figure still clutching at her treasure trove and flying wildly up the winding stair, with her ears ringing perhaps with the muffled screams from behind her. Here was the secret of her blanched face, her shaken nerves, her peals of hysterical laughter on the next morning. But what had been in the box? What had she done with that? "These are coins of Charles I," said he, holding out the few which had been in the box. "You see, we were right in fixing our date for the ritual. We may find something else of Charles I," I cried, as the probable meaning of the first 2 questions of the ritual broke suddenly upon me. "Let me see the contents of the bag which you fished from the mere." I ascended to his study, and he laid the débris before me. I could understand his regarding it as of small importance, for the metal was almost black and the stones lustreless and dull. I rubbed one of them on my sleeve, however, and it glowed afterwards like a spark in the dark hollow of my hand.
My ancestor, Sir Ralph Musgrave, was a prominent cavalier and the right-hand man of Charles II in his wanderings, said my friend.
"Ah, indeed," I answered. "Well now, I think that really should give us the last link that we wanted. I must congratulate you on coming into the possession of a relic which is of great intrinsic value, but of even greater importance as an historical curiosity. It is nothing less than the ancient crown of the kings of England."
The crown?
"Precisely."
"And how was it, then, that Charles did not get his crown when he returned?"
asked Musgrave. "Ah, there you lay your finger upon the one point which we shall probably never be able to clear up. Of the woman nothing was ever heard, and the probability is that she got away out of England and carried herself and the memory of her crime to some land beyond the seas.